Chapter 2. The moment the hatch slid closed, Dickerson's stomach began to flutter. He had been hit harder than he thought. When Callie had reversed the polarity on the skiff and injected them into space, he'd only had a moment to scream before the lights went out. Waking and seeing nothing but stars had filled him with the most gut-wrenching fear of his life. The concussion? That was just the cherry on top of the shit sundae. Nausea? Check. Dizziness? Check. A headache that feels like artillery going off in your skull? Double check. And now here I am dragging a goddamn corpse. The small cockpit barely had enough room for him to slide the body past the co-pilot chair. The corpse's legs bent slightly, and ice crystals popped from the flexed limbs. The frozen water shimmered in the cabin. It would have been beautiful if not for the entrails dangling through this mess. A status light popped up in his HUD. He had 10 minutes of O2 left. Unless he found additional reserves, he'd have to get back to the shuttle very quickly. He wondered just how much O2 the shuttle had, not to mention how much was left in the others' suits. This is beginning to be a bit too much like the SAT battle, he thought. Dickerson grinned beneath his helmet. He'd stayed alive for 20 hours amidst the wreckage of T-87s, freighters, and satellites by pilfering O2 from the dead, both Marines and rebels, as well as from the remaining intact fuselages. It had been hours upon hours of fighting, hiding, fleeing, and scrounging. But he'd made it. And I'll make it through this too, he told himself. He found the door controls, said a prayer to the void, and activated them. The starboard side hatch opened into the darkness of the shuttle bay. There was no illumination save for the barely lit holo display on the dashboard and his suit lights. For a moment, Dickerson paused to watch for any movement beyond the hatch opening. The nausea in his stomach increased, and he loosed a sour belch. When nothing moved, he put his hands beneath the corpse's armpits and pushed. The dead man from the cargo hold slowly disappeared into the pitch darkness. Dickerson shivered. So long, my friend, he thought. He turned around and looked at the pilot's chair. The dead pilot, or whomever he once was, didn't seem as damaged as the corpse he tossed out of the hatch. He took a deep breath before walking to the chair, placed a hand on the corpse's shoulder, and froze. The icy droplets of blood hanging in the air that he could see were nothing compared to the far port side. A third of the man's jumpsuit had been clawed and eaten away along with the majority of his flesh. Broken and gnawed ribs exposed a savaged stomach cavity with oily-looking yellow and green drops that had splattered against the bulkhead. The far side of the man's face was little more than a ragged skull. Dickerson felt his gorge rise again and once more choked it back.
Get moving, Marine.
He blinked and slowly grinned. That had been Gunny's voice inside his head. Good old Gunny, he said aloud. His HUD flashed yellow. 9 minutes of O2 left. He grabbed the pilot's shoulder and pulled him from the chair. There was no sound in the vacuum, but as he lifted the body, the crackle and rip of torn flesh and fabric seared his imagination. The cabin filled with dislodged dark red ice crystals. He ground his teeth together and continued to pull the corpse to the open hatch, doing his best to ignore the bits of gut dangling from the body's savage side. With one final push, he managed to send it through the hatch and into the darkness beyond. Corporal, he said through his block, do you read me? Aye, Dickerson. He stepped forward through the hatch. His suit lights stabbed through the blackness but showed him nothing. He turned and faced the shuttle, the bare illumination from the holo display looking warm and inviting compared to the emptiness surrounding him. Closing the cockpit hatch. Suggest we leave the cockpit depressurized for now. Don't want to waste more O2 than we need to. Kelly paused before replying. Understood, Dickerson. Good hunting. Yeah, he said aloud to no one. Good hunting indeed. For the next 7 minutes, anyway. He punched the manual controls and the shuttle cockpit hatch closed. The light from the holo display slowly disappeared. When the hatch finished closing, only his suit lights shined in the nearly impenetrable darkness. He turned and surveyed the bay walls. If there was an O2 station, it was likely on the starboard side toward Mira's interior. He took a deep breath, his eyes darting again to his oxygen reading, and walked to the wall. Using his block connection to the suit, He changed the focus of the lights from narrow to broad. The bright beams seemed to dim, although he knew it was just diffusion. The outmost steel wall seemed to soak up the light like a sponge. As he mag-walked along the wall, he made out small indentations, as well as rips and tears through the outer shell. He had 6.5 minutes of O2 left, but he took the time to add timestamps on his video feed. If nothing else, they might ultimately be able to send the data back to Black. "Like that'll matter," he said aloud. For each meter of wall he traveled, another few seconds ticked off on his O2 counter. In 3 minutes, he'd be past the point of no return to get back to the shuttle and its oxygen reserves. "Damn it, Mira, cut me a break." He turned his head slightly, his helmet light stabbing through the darkness near the middle of the bay. Something moved. A shiver crawled up his spine. "Whatever it is, boy, it's dead. There's nothing alive in here." Somehow that thought didn't make him feel any better. The silence was getting to him. In space, when he was performing S&R operations or hunting down combatants, comm chatter filled his mind, or there were specific objectives that drew his focus, and there was always light. But here, inside Mira's shuttle bay, with no schematics of the interior, no clue what happened, and no information on what they faced, the silence was a death shroud. "You have 6 minutes of oxygen remaining," an alarm said through his block. The sound of it in his mind nearly made him jump. 6 minutes. "Fuck the magnetics," he said aloud. He disengaged the boots and pumped his knees slightly. He rose 0.5 meter above the deck before firing a thruster to stop his momentum. Dickerson took a deep breath and hit the rear suit thrusters. He flew through the bay toward the rear at 1 meter per second, fighting the urge to swing his head and look at the shadows he saw in his peripheral vision. If he missed an O2 station because he was too busy jumping at things that weren't there, they were probably all going to die. He moved down the wall, his suit illuminating a 2-meter tall, 2-meter wide square. More chinks in the wall, more strange markings, more "Yahoo!" he yelled aloud. He hit the thrusters to slow his momentum, placed a mag glove on the wall, and came to a lurching stop before a tank embedded in the steel. The half cylinder stuck out 1/4 meter from the wall itself. His lights reflected off photosensitive paint that said, "Emergency O2." Grinning, he lowered himself using his gloves until his boots struck the floor. He engaged the magnetics and walked around to the front of the tank. The nozzles of 3 retractable pressure hoses protruded from the wall. He bent his knees and shined his lights across the panel above the station. Without ship power, the status display was dead. Dickerson pressed a button on the panel and a handle slid out. He clutched the handle and began to crank the manual generator. After 5 turns, a yellow light came to life. "That's right, baby," he said to himself. "Drink in the juice." The display flickered, the screen's background switching between deep black and a wan amber hue. He continued rotating the crank. No flickers now. The display had turned a deep solid amber. The status bar appeared at the bottom of the screen, the indicator at 75%. 4 more cranks and the bar filled. The screen flashed once and the status lights turned green. He let his hand off the crank, stowed it, and stared at the display. 10,000 liters available. "Yahoo!" he yelled inside his helmet. That was enough atmosphere to keep the 4 of them alive for days. Hell, they might even be able to refill the shuttle. He little doubt they would find other reserve stations around the bay, let alone Mira herself. Assuming even half of them worked, the 4 of them could survive for weeks. He pulled one of the nozzles from the wall, opened a flap on the suit's arm, and plugged the nozzle into the suit. "Ready for O2, his HUD announced. Fingers crossed on his free hand, he pressed the fill button on the display. The atmosphere gauge on his suit went from red to green in a matter of seconds. "That could be poison you just filled your tanks with," a voice said in his mind. Dickerson's skin popped with gooseflesh. He hesitated, his last breath of air still in his lungs. The little voice had sounded like a terrified child, afraid of what lay outside the housing hatch. He grunted. "If it is," he thought, "we're all dead anyway." He forced the air from his lungs and took a deep breath. The air tasted antiseptic, more like the air from Trident Station than that of S&R Black. His heart thumped rapidly as he waited to see if he simply keeled over and died. Nothing happened. His heart rate slowed. He took in another pull of air, repeated, and finally began to breathe normally. You just saved everybody, he thought to himself, at least for now. He turned around in a slow circle, his lights penetrating the shadows for a few meters. Besides the gleam of another shuttle further down the bay and a few unsecured tools, there wasn't much to see. Corporal, he said through the block. Still there? Still here, Kelly said. Any luck? Yes, ma'am. About 40 meters down from the shuttle. We have an O2 refill station. Excellent, she said. Does it? Aye, Corporal. I just topped off my tanks. I can come back and relieve you so you can do the same. For a moment, there was no response. Dickerson then realized the problem. They had to find a way to get Elliot and Carb to the station and not just Kalimura. Elliot was in the worst shape, but could they move him without killing him? All right, Dickerson, come on back. Carb and I are getting Elliot ready. Aye, Corporal. Dickerson took another deep breath before patting the oxygen station. See you in a few, he said to it. Now that he had O2 in the tanks, there was no reason to disengage the mag boots and float along the wall at a dangerous clip. No, fuck that. He was walking. He refocused his suit lights, eschewing the diffuse, broad illumination. The shadows immediately tightened around him, but they didn't bother him as much now. They had a safe path from the shuttle to the station, and that's what mattered. Everything else on the ship was dead. Mira had no power and had been in a deep freeze for Christ knew how long. Even if any of the ship's personnel had managed to make it into stasis, he doubted the redundancy systems would have been able to survive the estimated 43 years since Mira what? The engineering decks were in ruins. The ship had strange perforations, melted metal, those damned pine cone things, and other types of damage that should have blown her to pieces. The idea of any of the crew surviving all of that was laughable. But still, the ship was here. They simply had to explore her. But not now, he thought. Gotta get Elliot and Carb back to Black.